This is Garis book readings of my 2 published paper books. This is chapter 4, entitled Costs of the Nation-State System, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis. Taken from my second book entitled Multis and Monos, what the multicultured can teach the monocultured towards the creation of a global state. Chapter 4, Costs of the Nation-State System. Subtopic headings: A. Introduction. B. Arms building and the arms trade. C. War and conscription. D. Monocultured ignorance hurts. E. Cultures of scale. A. Introduction. The first 3 chapters dealt more with relations between monos and multis. For the rest of the book, we deal with a much bigger topic that follows on naturally from these first 3 chapters. Once one accepts that a mono can learn from the superiorities of another culture, then it's obvious that he can learn a lot more from the superiorities of all the cultures on the planet. To enable such learning, a global media will be needed, glow media. But such a media will be so powerful that it will probably be the dominating factor, amongst others, that will be discussed in chapter 5, that pushes the 200 plus nation states of today into forming a global state. Hence the remaining chapters of this book, including this one, deal with the desirability of, the forces creating, the institutions of, the agenda of, the consequences of, and the benefits of a global state called Globa, G-L-O-B-A. This chapter is aimed at convincing readers that living in a global state would be a very good thing, because at the time of writing we live in a sovereign nation-state system. That relative living in a global state has many severe costs and disadvantages. This chapter is devoted to describing such costs by presenting 4 examples. The first deals with the awful waste, to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars per year, that the planet spends in arms manufacture and research into more efficient ways of killing each other. The second topic deals with the far worse consequences of actual warfare between nation states, and the even greater tragedy that the combatants, in most cases, don't want to fight. They are conscripted. The third topic is one of the recurrent themes of this book, namely the idea that living in monocultures is actually harmful to people, again, in comparison to what they could have if they lived in a global state, that is, a culturally homogeneous global state. The fourth topic tries to explain the concept of cultures of scale, a term that is analogous to economies of scale. The main idea is that by living in a global state with its huge population and cultural homogenization, global citizens, globans, will be able to benefit from the cultural richness coming from a whole planet rather than from only a single nation state. Conversely, by not living in a global state at the time of writing, we all miss out on that global richness. B. Arms building and the arms trade. Go back many centuries, before there were police forces, before transport systems moved faster than horses. In such times, in many areas of the world, people lived in constant fear of losing their lives at the hands of roving bandits, gangs, and pillagers. They built city walls, castles, etc. for protection. At any time, villagers could be robbed of their livestock, have their crops burned, see their women raped and carried off, and themselves killed. Life in those days was accurately described by Hobbes to be poor, nasty, brutish, and short. As villages grew into towns and towns into cities, law and order was imposed by a central power, often the king or a prince. People were actually quite happy to subject themselves to such an authority, because at least they felt fairly safe living here. This is one of the main ideas of Hobbes, with his idea of Leviathan. So the dictatorial king figure who could impose order and lack of crime onto a people, which the people wanted. In times of war or tyrannical dictatorship, the villagers were often defenceless against the murdering pillagers who came to their villages. In times of civil war, especially during the times of the religious wars in Europe in the 16th century, 17th century, Armed soldier groups of one religious group would ride into the villages of the rival religious group and slaughter them. Yeah, this is 17th century wars, like 30 Years' War in Germany. Then, as revenge, a larger group of armed soldiers on the other side would slaughter a larger group of villagers or townspeople on the first side, etc. In such times of chaos, German 30 Years' War, people long for peace, for law and order, and for a central authority to keep the willful slaughter of innocent people. In the cities, as they got richer, local governments created a police force to enforce the laws. Murderers were often caught and punished. Prison systems became more elaborate, and sentencing policies were established. Legal practices and the rule of law became better developed, so that the horrors of the past gradually died out. People no longer felt the need to build city walls for protection. Castles became historical relics. Generally speaking, people felt safer, at least within their own nation-states. But as transport systems became more effective, soldiers and military equipment could be moved faster and in greater quantities than before. For example, consider the impact that the railways had on World War I. So the size of conflicts between nations grew. Peace may have been imposed on a nation-state's citizens by an internal central authority, but the same logic did not apply to the planet because there was no such planetary authority to impose its will on the citizens of the planet. This is where we are today. We still live in a nation-state system, which, although on a larger scale, is not very different in principle from the rival armed soldier groups of the 17th century Europe. We still live in fear, not from being killed by bands of thugs riding into town on horses to burn our crops, rape the women and kill the men. Those days are long gone. But worse, we live in fear of being vaporized in our millions by megaton hydrogen bombs being missiled into our cities from another nation-state with a different ideology from the one we happen to live in. For decades now, our nation-state governments have stockpiled tens of thousands of these megaton nuclear warhead weapons to frighten the other side with mutually assured destruction, MAD, MAD. If one side was insane enough to launch its missiles against the other, then the other would launch its missiles against the first side. Everyone would die, mutually assured destruction. At the present time, the major nuclear powers of the world are all too conscious that as more nation-states join the nuclear club, that is, those countries that already have nuclear weapons, the greater is the risk that one day there will be a nuclear war, and that it might escalate into a major nuclear war between the nuclear superpowers, involving thousands of megaton warheads, causing firestorms in the bombed cities, and releasing so much ash into the atmosphere that the sunlight cannot penetrate the haze, plunging the planet into a nuclear winter, in which the plants die for lack of sunlight, and then most of humanity dies too, due to lack of food. The members of the nuclear club put pressure on the non-members to stay that way, but the non-members can easily feel the hypocrisy of the members, who are saying to them effectively, "Do as I say, not as I do." Over time, the number of club members keeps growing, so that indeed the risk of a nuclear war increases. It costs millions of dollars to make a nuclear warhead and its missile to transport it. Hundreds of billions of dollars are wasted every year worldwide in producing war materials and paying the salaries of professional nation-state government-sponsored killers to defend the nation-state if a rival nation-state attacks it. The amount of money spent in fear of annihilation each year is one of the great tragedies of our modern era. Hopefully, if we can survive another century during the time taken to create a global state, future historians will look back at our present time with horror and label us as barbarians, as primitives, because we lived in such benighted times, wasting hundreds of billions of dollars. That would be much better spent in eradicating poverty from the world, rather than using it to frighten our rival nation-states. By creating a global state, we can get rid of the need to spend huge amounts of money on weapons. For example, the US alone spends about $350 billion each year on defense. By definition, the global state is a central state, presumably elected, that governs and polices all peoples of the earth. There will be no more nation-states, hence no more inter-nation-state rivalries, no more fear of being annihilated by a nuclear holocaust just because the leaders of two different nation-states have different ideologies. By reinvesting the hundreds of billions of dollars, or using the global currency unit, globos, like euro, globo, A year wasted on arms manufacture into economic activities, it will be possible to make everyone on the planet rich. Economists today, despite the huge military waste of armament spending, have plans on how to do this, given sufficient inter-nation-state agreement to make it happen. With a global state, not only will nation-state governments not be wasting hundreds of billions of dollars a year on building their own nation-state weapons systems, but the international arms trade will be stopped as well. At the present time, even so-called civilized democratic governments manufacture billions of dollars worth of arms and then sell them to other nation-states and smaller groups using the rationalization, if they don't do it, then other nation-state governments will, and make a lot of money in the process. The biggest offenders are in fact the big democracies, the US and Europe. These high-tech political blocs are capable of designing and building the world's most sophisticated weapons, and hence their products are in demand by nation-states who fear being invaded by other nation-states, so they try to buy the best weapons they can afford. This in turn alarms their rival neighbour nation-states who feel they too need to buy advanced weapons to match them. This is all very profitable to the sellers and amounts to a business of many billions of dollars per year. Now, of course, these weapons are not lying idle. There are always wars going on somewhere around the world, so these arms sales have a purpose. The weapons are actually used, and millions of people die because of them. The nation-state governments and private arms merchants truly are merchants of death. With the creation of a global state, several major changes relating to the manufacture of arms would take place. Firstly, nuclear weapons would be banned across the planet. The present stockpile would be destroyed, and no one would be allowed to make them unless supervised by the global state. Secondly, the arms trade would be banned. Arms traders would become arms smugglers and be punished if caught. Arms traders need arms manufacturers, but as they too are put out of business by the global state, except for a few needed to supply the global police force and global military, the arms traders would have nothing to trade with. Also, the demands for arms would dry up once the global state started settling disputes via the global court, the way intra-nation state disputes are settled by national courts today. With hundreds of billions of dollars a year freed up from the arms trade, this money could be channeled into more productive pursuits, such as making people richer across the planet. C. War and conscription. In the 20th century, about 300 million people died for political reasons: wars, purges, genocides, holocausts, ethnic cleansings, etc. It was the most murderous, bloodiest century in human history, largely because science and technology was applied to making killing more efficient on a larger scale. War is a nightmare. Your loved ones get injured or worse, killed. Towns and cities are bombed or burned. People are forced to become refugees. Loved ones are conscripted to fight and often do not come back. War is an abomination. War is the greatest source of suffering that humanity has experience of. There are other comparable horrors, of course, such as mass starvation or a plague, but war instills real gut-wrenching fear into millions of people and darkens their personalities. Returned soldiers suffer post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, reliving in their dreams the horrors of what they saw in combat, such as their fellow soldiers getting killed, arms being shot off, bodies blown to pieces, the screams of their comrades burning to death. Actually, statistically speaking, our recent half-century has been relatively peaceful, due very probably to the existence of the stockpiles of hydrogen bombs. No one dares use them through fear of MAD, M-A-D, mutually assured destruction. Whereas in primitive times, for example in the jungles of New Guinea, before colonization by the European powers and before a peace was imposed by the European police force with their guns, wars between neighbouring tribes was almost constant, for example every 2 years or so. This recent half-century has given humanity a taste of what global peace might be like. Of course, there have been wars during this period, but nothing like the horrors of World War II. With the establishment of a global state, this feeling of peace that the younger generations in the Western countries tend to take for granted would become the universal norm. Wars are tragic enough, but what is most tragic about them is that due to their industrial scale and as organised by the nation-states fighting them, the numbers of people involved in them during the past century has been in the millions. Nation-state governments have conscripted their young men in the past, brainwashing them that the greatest sacrifice they can make is to die for their country. In a nation-state, with a monocultured media, it's easy for a government to brainwash its citizens into doing whatever it wants. It only has to brainwash the minds of young men, too immature to be full adults with critical judgment and still primed to parental authority. In World War I, the European powers threatened to kill their own conscripts if they refused to fight. The young men, fresh from their schools and parents' homes, did not have a multicultured viewpoint, nor did they have enough emotional maturity to rebel, that is, to tell their own leaders to go to hell, or more effectively still, to assassinate them. The great tragedy of monocultured conscripts is that they can be so easily brainwashed into doing what their nation-state leaders want. Monocultured nation-states had control of their monocultured media, and hence they were able to give a monocultured view of things to their young men, and in fact to their whole populations. In World War I, the English made monsters out of the Germans, and vice versa. It's easier to kill someone you believe is a monster. The tragedy then was that millions of young men were herded into the trains to be sent to the front to die like flies at the hands of modern technology, mainly machine guns, artillery shells, and gas. A global state will do away with such tragedies. There will be no such thing as what I call the tyranny of monocultured media. Nation-states will no longer exist, so it will not be possible for them to brainwash their monocultured citizens into a monocultured view of other nation-state citizens. Global state citizens will receive the media of the whole world, making it virtually impossible for anyone to be brainwashed into a monocultured mindset. Global citizens will think globally with a sense of cultural relativity because their brains will have been exposed to the global media for many years. If a dispute does arise between two groups, then the world will be able to watch the media of both sides and make up their own minds. The group members of both sides will be able to do the same. The dispute can then be adjudicated upon by the global court. That should settle the matter. If it doesn't, then as a last resort, there's always the global military, whose job is essentially to be the world's military policeman. With the world media, with opinions from 1,000 different sources in the world language, it will be almost impossible for a particular group to keep holding an opinion if the vast majority of the rest of humanity opposes it. Probably the best global policeman, once the global media is established and in a global language, will be the global public opinion. It will keep nearly everyone in line. D. Monocultured ignorance hurts. One of the major recurring messages of this book is the idea that billions of people do themselves damage due to their adherence to stupid customs. Of course, being monos, they will not see their customs as being stupid. If they are real monos, they probably don't even question their customs. They continue their customs for no other reason than that they are customs. That is what customs are, behaviours that are repeated generation after generation, largely through inertia. Children behave in certain ways because their parents taught them to behave in those ways. Since monos are monos, they do not have the intercultural experience of being multis to be able to question their customs. So if a particular custom is seen by onlooking multis as particularly stupid or damaging, the mono won't be able to see that custom in the same light. There are lots of concrete examples, and Chapters 2 and 3 have already addressed themselves in detail to many of these examples. But to make a point, let me take an abstract example that probably most people can identify with as being stupid and harmful. Imagine some native tribe where resources are scarce and whose neighbouring tribes are fierce and constantly warring against it. Not surprisingly, this tribe values warlike fierceness and courage very highly. It trains its young men to be warriors and to instill mental toughness in them. The principal means of doing this is to teach them as little boys that the boy who can hit his head against the wall the hardest and the longest is the bravest and the most honourable. All the boys and the men have calloused foreheads with very tough skin and suffer from sustained mild concussion. The need to breed fierce warriors for the sake of the survival of the tribe sustains and justifies the head banging the tribal elders rationalize. Then one day, a captured woman from a neighbouring warring tribe, once she has mastered the language of her captors, remarks to her wife-napping husband, "Why do the boys of your tribe not wrestle?" The husband is one of the tribal leaders and is more intelligent and curious than the others. He asks his wife to demonstrate. She does, and he asks her, "Why wrestle?" She says, "To train young men to be courageous and tough for fighting. Don't they bang heads? No, they wrestle. The husband, being a tribal elder, discusses the idea of wrestling with his colleagues in the tribal council. They experiment with wrestling with the young men and boys. It's very popular and allows the young men to show off their courage, endurance and strength. 10 years later, only the older, more traditional men are still bang their heads. The rest, especially the younger members of the tribe, consider head banging as stupid and old-fashioned. I will give a few other examples, but this time close to home, to illustrate the point that monos suffer from their own limiting and inferior customs, but won't see them as inferior or limiting until they become multis and can compare them with the customs of other cultures. One of the cultural aspects of the Anglo-Saxon countries, that is UK, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., and I have lived in 3 of these, is English Puritanism. The UK colonies inherited their attitudes towards sexuality and the pleasures of the flesh from the Brits, unfortunately. The French, on the other hand, have much more open and relaxed attitudes towards sexuality, nudity, intercourse, boy-girl relations, etc., and sneer at the inhibited and repressed sexual attitudes of the British. Ils ne savent pas vivre, les Anglais. Ils s'en foutent. That's translated into English. They don't know how to live, the English. They're crazy. As a result of the openness and relaxed attitudes towards sex of the French, relations between the sexes are, in my view, the healthiest in the world, whereas in the US, in my opinion, they are second worst of the 7 countries I've lived in, with Japan being the worst. If millions of Americans could be exposed to French media and French attitudes to sex, they would be influenced by French values and would probably lose their puritanical attitudes. This was certainly my experience. I started off as an Anglo-Saxon Puritan, a product of my British colonial monoculture. But after living some years in French culture, I began to see the superiority of the French attitudes towards the pleasures of the flesh, and absorbed them into my personality. Since French culture is so much more sophisticated than the cultures I lived in previously, I became, I hope, more sophisticated as well, again by absorbing French influence. I particularly appreciated the way French culture nurtures its intellectuals, especially. If Americans, particularly American intellectuals, could be exposed to French quality media, it would change their lives. Now, New Yorkers, being richer and closer to Paris, have already learned of French superiority in many respects and use their travels to Paris as a status symbol to their friends, who are also aware of the greater level of sophistication of the Parisien. I know my own exposure to French culture definitely changed me. France is one of the top world-class cultures. It's culturally rich and, in my view, the most sophisticated in the world. Anyone exposed to it for a few years and learning to speak the language would inevitably be influenced by it, changed by it, made culturally richer by it. I think I'll stop there. I'm running out of memory. Ciao.